software development.
Outstanding. Thank you. And thanks to all you for hanging out with me. I appreciate it. Thanks for being here. It's great to be back in Krakow. This is the longest I've gone not being in this city. Normally I'm here at least a couple times a year, and then, you know, that whole pandemic thing kind of shut all that down. So it's great to be back in places that I've visited and love to be at. So thanks all for hanging out with me. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of these mental cognitive biases, fallacies that pop up in software. Now, you're all familiar with patterns. I mean, if you've done this job long enough, you know that we use patterns as a way of simplifying development because, you know what, we're not solving unique problems in a lot of instances. You know, and other people have solved some of these problems, and sometimes to greater or lesser degrees of success. We do need to be very cautious anytime we think, oh, I need to reinvent the wheel here. I somehow can do it better. Probably not. And so, of course, patterns start to emerge. And you realize that experienced designers, they don't reinvent things every time. They reuse experiences from the past. And I know this worked before, so I'm going to use it again here. Or as Pablo Picasso allegedly said, good artists copy, great artists steal. Now, from our point of view, this really started with Christopher Alexander. Now, he's an actual architect, not like me. I'm a software architect. I always make sure the word software is in front of it so that nobody confuses me as having any practical knowledge about how buildings work or anything like that. You know, sorry, I can't help you with your building codes or anything of that nature. We just love to steal terms from other industries because we're so young. So this individual actually did real architecture work, and amazingly enough, this completely unrelated field, he's influenced how we design programming languages, Agile, wikis, the OO programming, and he is widely considered the father of patterns languages. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say many of you have exposure to the Gang of Four Patterns book, GOF. This was pretty instrumental for me, a very fundamental piece of my knowledge growing up. I very distinctly remember when this came out. You know, I had the book, I had the little CD and everything, and I was really blown away by it. And so I was really surprised a couple years ago. I was talking with somebody, and I mentioned, well, you know, that's just a standard Gang of Four pattern. And this person just stared at me. And I'm like, well, you know, the Gang of Four, the GOF book. And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I had to Google it because I did not remember the actual title of the book, because it's always just been Gang of Four to me. And so I showed him, like, this book. And he's like, nope, never heard of it. I was like, wow, okay, we got a lot of work to do, I guess, to teach the fundamentals in this business. So the Gang of Four book has been around for quite a while. And what we realize is every single decision we make on a project is a trade-off. Every single one. That's the art of what we do. You know, as an architect, my answer to almost every question is, it depends. You know, and I did a workshop earlier this week, and one of the points I tried to make was, there's no best in what we do. There's like least worst is kind of what we're shooting for most of the time. You know, and that's a little hard for some of us to accept because, you know, you come out of school and you're used to, there's a version of this architecture that will get me an A. And then you get in the real world and you realize, like, we don't give out grades anymore. Sorry, that's not how it works. But every single decision we make is a trade-off. There's pros, there's cons, there's consequences. And so what's important for us is to understand that, you know, you're going to make a lot of decisions on a project, a lot of them. And some, at the time, are going to seem really inconsequential. This is unimportant, doesn't matter. And then a few years later, you go, oh, actually, that was a really big decision we made. Hopefully, you made the right one. I mean, that's one of the really interesting aspects of our job. We make all these decisions, and we don't know if we got it right until it's basically too late to do anything about it. It's kind of like being a parent. Right? I have a teenager, and I realize at some point that I won't know if I've done a good job until he's like an adult, and at that point there's no way to like do undo. Like there's no, can I go back in my Git history and try again? Like, no, that's just not how it works. And so what some very smart people decided to do is, let's write down these patterns, let's describe them to make it easier for people to reuse them later. Now, we run into patterns all the time without even realizing it. You know, think about your house, your apartment. You know, there's certain patterns that exist. There's patterns that exist in this room. You know, every room you have that you've entered has a door of some sort or another. Although obviously the implementation details of those doors, they vary quite considerably, right? From just very plain wood maybe to beautiful glass French door, very ornate, because you need to get into and out of a room. So we need a way to make that happen. If you think about your favorite TV show, movie, book, etc., you start to realize that some of those plot lines repeat themselves as well, and you kind of have the feeling of, hang on, this is just like that except this. I was describing this book series that I finished up earlier this year as, it's like Game of Thrones except in outer space. And someone immediately said, oh, the Expanse series. I went, you're correct. So it's really interesting how we make some of those connections. Maybe it is just a glitch in the matrix. I have no idea. It's very clear we only have a handful of plots. You know, there's the quest, the rags to riches, the overcoming the monster. Luckily for us, software has a lot of these same things. When I was in college, I remember having this conversation with my advisor, and I said, you know, why did you decide to go back and get your PhD? You know, he'd worked in industry for quite a while and went and got his PhD and came back to teach. And he said, Nate, I got tired of building the same application again and again and again. And I said, what do you mean? He said, essentially, all I'm doing is putting a front end on a relational database. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And then I got into the real world and realized that most of what I was doing was putting a web front end on a relational database. I remember my first web project taking an old COBOL mainframe system, putting it on the web, and I thought, oh, this is so revolutionary, this is so amazing. And then it took me a while to realize, you know, the mainframe is basically a form with holes in it, and you put in some data and you submit the data to a server. And then it took me a while to realize that's all I was doing on the web. There's a form with holes in it that you submit to a server. Now, some of the implementation details were quite a bit different, and on the web it could scroll, you know, so I guess we had that going for us. Now, I will admit that almost every application I've ever worked on, and I'm going to go on a limb and say you've had the same experience, probably boils down to spreadsheets and email. How many times have you had a customer say, could you just give me export to Excel and then I'll email that to somebody? I mean, it's just amazing how often we end up doing that for various incarnations of applications. And I think that's because that's what our customers are used to working with. And so they want our applications to mimic that. All right, so Goff came along and documented these. And I'm sure you're all familiar with several of them. Singleton, Proxy, Facade, Visitor. I remember being on a project where, and I think they meant this in jest, like the product owner, like person said, hey, we got 11 of the Goff patterns into this release. We're hoping to get the rest in the next release. I'm pretty sure that was meant as a joke, I hope. All right, but there's lots and lots of other examples out there. You know, you're probably familiar with Martin's work around enterprise architecture. I helped write a book on how to apply patterns to presentations. They're a really powerful concept. Right? They help us reuse stuff, which is great. You should not reinvent the wheel. They allow us to leverage proven solutions, and it can save us a ton of time because now I've got a much coarser building block that I can start with. I'm not beginning at a blank editor at this point. It allows me to put my time and effort and energy on the things that are unique in my space. This also gives us a really convenient handle. Names are so powerful, and they're hard too, by the way. We've all had that, writing through some code trying to come up with, ooh, what's a good name for this variable? You know, foo is not it, by the way. They're a great alias. They're a great shortcut, and they allow what one of my friends describes as higher bandwidth conversations. Because I say the word facade, and I've now conveyed a whole bunch of information with that one term. Of course, I have to assume that you know what I mean when I say facade. If not, then we're going to have another conversation to make sure you know where we're at there. Now, there's more to patterns than just how we build software. Turns out us human beings also have some patterns that we fall into. Some people refer to these as cognitive biases. And so my hope is that by making you aware of them, you can either avoid them or at least deal with them when you inevitably encounter them. One of the bar none most common things I encounter on software projects is not invented here, otherwise known as NIH or not my idea. Not entirely sure why this is so extremely common, but I've been on a lot of projects where people assume we can obviously build something better than the off-the-shelf solution. This is usually accompanied with some description of why we are so unique. What we do is so special. No one does anything like this in the entire world. By the way, that usually is because some vice president has been preaching that message because they want a bigger budget and a bigger staff. And I mean, that's where a lot of this stuff comes from. I worked in an investment space for a long time, and we had this sort of home-built system that in reality probably would have been better served by buying something off the shelf. It would have been more powerful, would have been a lot easier for us to deal with. But, you know, they were special, so they got what they wanted, which I guess is okay because it kept me employed for a bunch of years, so, you know, trade-offs. Now, sometimes there actually is secret sauce, in which case it is in your best interest to own that. But we need to be focused on what makes us different. A lot of organizations, for better or worse, have a very strong bias against any idea that comes from the outside. And in some cases, they're incredibly biased against ideas that come from certain spots. Like, oh, we don't do anything for that company. We don't like that company. A lot of times this boils down to politics. This boils down to turf wars. This boils down to jealousy. This boils down to budget fights. It's a lot of what this is. You know, when I became an architect, one of the more, I guess, disappointing aspects of getting into that line of work is I was much more exposed to the politics of my organization. As a developer, I could just kind of hide in the project room and just bang on code and not worry about all that messy stuff. And then you become an architect and you're like, uh-oh, yeah, no, I have to deal with that because I got to go talk to all these people. And I've been in a lot of organizations where we've built our own frameworks. I was at one company, and I shouldn't even say this, but we basically built our own version of JSPs. You guys remember JSPs? Now, in fairness, when we started that project, JSPs didn't exist yet. All right, so we were a little ahead of the curve. And it did help us, but then it became kind of this boat anchor because, oh no, JSPs are here and they're pretty mature and that's really what we should be using. And so now we got to get rid of this thing that we used to do. And my friend Neil's got a great way of phrasing why we love to do this, and it's meta work is more interesting than work. So yeah, I could put another field on that form, but you know what would really stress my talents, what's really, you know, a challenge worthy of me is building a framework to put a field on a form. Now that's something I can sink my teeth into. So it's a lot more interesting to be the person that builds the framework than the person that just, you know, builds the app. I was at one organization where they had essentially recreated Spring. And this blew my mind. Like, why would you do that? That's illogical. Spring exists for a reason. But you know what? Those developers had a lot of fun writing it. They thought that was pretty awesome. And I actually had someone try to explain to me that, no, it's much better that we have our own because we wrote it. And we have these 3 people on staff who wrote it, and so we're experts on it. And I thought to myself, yeah, but how many people in the world are experts on Spring? It's a lot more than 3. By the way, this is often a sign of insecurity. I can't bother to admit there might be better ideas out there. One of my favorite examples of this, I was at this organization, and I tried to introduce a dynamic language. I tried to bring Groovy into the company. We had a very specific problem. Groovy was going to solve it. And interesting enough, it was just part of our build. So it wasn't even going to ship with the product. And so I thought, hey, this is perfect. This solves this immediate problem we have right here. It's super simple. We drop this in, boom, it just works. And the person who owned our build at the time, his response to me was, we don't resort to wacky workarounds here. Which I thought was hilarious because his entire build was a wacky workaround. I mean, they had like built something on top of Ant. It was nuts. I was kind of like, huh, well, interesting. You still don't have a way to solve this problem, and I can solve it for you in about a half a day's of work, but okay. Now, interestingly enough, about 6 months later, this same individual discovered Groovy, and all of a sudden, oh my God, Groovy's amazing. Groovy solves all these cool problems. Everybody, we're using Groovy all over the place. I thought, well, that's interesting. When I introduced it, you weren't interested, but then you found it, and all of a sudden, it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Very similar to that, a lot of people just don't want to share credit. They want all the credit for coming up with that idea, implementing that idea. And a lot of people are very hesitant to say, oh, no, the credit really belongs to so-and-so. Or, yeah, no, we did this together. There are some people who have an emotional need to own the spotlight. The attention has to be on them. Now, it's important to understand, friends, none of this is a zero-sum game. And I had hoped, naively, that most of us learned how to play nice with others in kindergarten. But there are some people who clearly missed that year of school. Very clear. Now, a really closely related thing is something known as the Ikea Effect. There's this really interesting bias that happens where we place a higher value on a thing if we were the ones that created it, if we were the ones that put it together. There was actually one study that said people would spend 63% more if they were the ones that put it together. So 2 identical shelves, one that I had to use the stupid little key to try to put it together that I dropped 75 times while I'm doing it and, you know, wrecked my hand and whatnot. But if one of you assembled it, I wouldn't pay as much for the one you assembled as I would for the one I assembled. Because, well, I built this. This is mine. You know, it's a very interesting approach. Now, related to that is the mere exposure effect. So familiarity may breed contempt, but we genuinely prefer things that we are familiar with. So I'm not going to lie. I tend to stay at the same hotels when I travel because I'm familiar with it. I know where the hotel is. I know what's around the hotel. I'm comfortable in that space. Every hotel I stayed in this week is hotels I've stayed in before. I am convinced this is part of the rather extreme dogmatism some people have around programming languages. This is another one of those really interesting things I've noticed about developers. Many of us think that time began with whatever the first language we learned was. That's the beginning. Nothing preceded this. My favorite example of that, when Java was starting to introduce lambdas, on some Java mailing list, someone said, I don't understand why Java needs these newfangled lambdas. And a much smarter person than I shut that person down more gently than I would have for sure, explaining how you do realize lambdas have been around since essentially the very beginning of programming languages. In fact, it was in Oak before they took it out. So it's not a new idea. Of course, this is also why my dear friend Layla is a C# programmer, and she and I have been working on some stuff, and every time she shows me some, it's hard to say some of these words. Every time she shows me some C#, there we go, try saying that 10 times fast. Whew. I always have to say to her, why do you have such weird capitalization on everything? And then she kind of glares at me, and she says, what are you talking about? You Java people capitalize things wrong. And this is where you take a step back and realize, you know what, most of this is pretty darn arbitrary. You put your brackets here, you put your brackets there. I'll never forget pairing with this developer, and he was using Emacs, so that tells you how long ago this was. And we spent like the first 45 minutes with just him going through reformatting everything. I don't know why we didn't have some kind of automatic formatter. Maybe those didn't exist at the time. But he was like, I can't even work on this code if the brackets are in the wrong place. And I'm like, really, is that what we should be spending our time on? Like, there's a problem we need to fix. Can we try to fix the problem? Like, no, he literally could not even look at the code if it wasn't formatted in the right way. Now, I get to spend a lot of time in organizations, and one of the things that I hear a lot, and I am convinced this is the most dangerous phrase you can utter inside a company's walls, that's how we've always done it. I hear this a lot. I was at one company helping them with a performance problem, and they were walking me through their architecture. And essentially what it boiled down to for every one of their clients, they've got, you know, buckets of widgets, and they process each widget, and then they do some stuff, and then they go on to the next client and process all their boxes of widgets. And I asked what I thought was a fairly simple question. I said, well, hang on. So when you're processing a box of widgets, does the processing of widget A have anything to do with the processing of widget B? And there's kind of this pregnant pause, and they said, no, we do some aggregation at the end, but no, so I said, instead of doing them serially, could you do them in parallel? Could you have a set of workers that just like grab the next widget, and there was kind of like this, again, pregnant pause of, yeah, that would work. Now, I'd like to think that I had some special skill. I don't really think that was the case. I just didn't have the baggage of, well, we've always done it serially. So we have to do it serially. No, you don't. There's always other ways. I will admit my wife does a really good job of helping me see this. She's a business analyst. And so one of her favorite phrases is, stop solutioning me. Tell me what your requirements are. And she's really good at saying, well, I know you keep going back to this, but is that a requirement, or are you trying to give me implementation details? It's like, good point. So why is NIH such a problem? Well, one of the things I always like to remind organizations is the status quo isn't free. What you're doing today has a cost. Your current approach has a cost. How much is that costing you? A lot of times it's an opportunity cost. Because we're using this homegrown thing, it's harder for us to hire. It's harder for us to attract. It's harder for us to retain. We have a staff of people that's maintaining this. That's costing us money. I remember talking to one organization like, oh, no, we don't let anyone buy an IDE. That's crazy talk. We use this free IDE, and we have a team of 7 developers that maintains our free IDE. I thought, hang on, you have 7, how much is that costing you? That's got to be way more expensive than just buying everybody IntelliJ. But that was their mindset, that the IDE was free, and they ignored the fact that they had a staff of people working on it. When I think back to the organizations I've worked in that had these hand-rolled frameworks, they refused to acknowledge how much effort and money they were putting into those hand-rolled frameworks. They pretended like that money doesn't exist. It does, because those are folks that aren't working on your customers' problems. And at the end of the day, the folks that pay us to write software, they want us to solve their problems. They don't want us reinventing the wheel for the nth time. So think about what your customers want you working on day in, day out. They want you adding features, functionality, fixing bugs. Everything else is dial tone. We need to move above the value line as much as possible. Or as I like to say, it's less of this undifferentiated heavy lifting. I think back to the old days of software infrastructure where we spent all this time and effort patching servers and everything like that. And it always reminds me, this is one of my all-time favorite slides. That's my old boss, Andrew Clay Schaefer. Good job configuring servers this year, said no CEO ever. Now, is it important work? Sure. But nobody gets a raise or a bonus for that. Nobody. Our customers want features. Our customers want functionality. And I always like to remind people in our community that to most of the world, spring is a season. It's not a Java framework. It's actually a very nice season most places. You get outside, the weather's nice again. It's always interesting to me, by the way, as a total aside, to see how much, and I know I can say this here because your climate's very similar to mine, that weather in the spring where we're all like out in shorts and t-shirts and like, this is amazing. And then in the fall, we're like, whew, boy, it's cold. We're putting on sweatshirts and we're like, this is not right. It's amazing how quickly our bodies adapt. You also will often overlook simpler solutions. I wish our industry was more focused on simplicity. We almost fetishize complexity to our own detriment, by the way. It's amazing how often just a little bit of that effort could save you days or weeks or even months if you use something off the shelf. Not to mention it's a heck of a lot easier to hire. There's a lot of developers that know Spring. By definition, your homegrown thing has a very small pool of applicants because, well, they're the people that work for you already. Now, this often coincides with the sunk cost fallacy, which is what many, many, many people do to justify continuing spending. We've already spent this much money, and since we've already spent this much money, we need to continue spending this much money. Actually, no, we don't. But there's a lot of people who think if we stop now, it's like we're throwing all that away. The diet analogy is, well, I ate an entire pizza for lunch, so I might as well eat an entire cake now because I've already eaten the pizza. That's not how it works. The end of the day, friends, the past is the past. It's gone. Nothing you can do can change that. I've had this conversation with my son multiple times. You should learn the lesson from the past. You should learn from your mistakes for sure, but don't beat yourself up about it. There's nothing you can do now that's going to change that. That's done and gone. That's just the way it is. Sorry. Until we invent a time machine, and then that's going to be a whole nother mess, right? Still haven't quite figured out how that works in the MCU, but your mileage may vary. At the end of the day, we should be willing on projects to take a step back and go, hang on, should we keep going down this path, or is it time to turn back? Given what we know today, what's the right choice? There's that old adage that says, if you find yourself in a hole, put the shovel down. Stop digging. I'm just amazed at how often we just keep doing that. We're just like, I don't know, I'm just going to keep digging this hole and let's see what happens. It's not going to get better. It's also really powerful to ask why. We don't do this enough on projects. We just assume, well, we must have a good reason. Maybe, maybe not. maybe no one bothered to ask before. My question at this company, why do you do it serially instead of in parallel? Because when they started, they only had a couple clients, they only had a few boxes of widgets, it completed in a few minutes, half an hour, whatever, and it was only as they became more successful that this became a problem. We can absolutely get myopic, every one of us. We absolutely get set in our ways, especially as we get older. We have certain things, that's just the way I like it. Don't ask me to change, I'm old. That's one of the benefits of age. You can just say, I'm old, I'm not gonna change. I was at this one company, and I was looking at some of our web pages, and I asked my colleague, I said, hey, Jeff, why are we closing the tag on the following line? I mean, I realize that the parser doesn't care, but it just looks weird to me. And he said, well, we had this bug in an older version of Tomcat that if you closed it on the same line, you couldn't change the language encoding later. And I said, huh, that's weird. And he said, yeah, I know. And I said, well, do we still support that version of Tomcat? No. Is it still a problem on the current version of Tomcat? Oh, no, they fixed that a long time ago. Like, then why are we still doing that? And he said, oh, it's probably just an old file, Nate. I said, well, no, according to the source code control here, it was just added yesterday. He's like, oh yeah, we shouldn't have done that. But I'm sure somebody just saw that and said, well, I don't know, I guess we just closed tags on the following line. I'm sure we have a good reason. That reason was, that's how we've always done it. Never, ever dismiss the power of a fresh perspective. That's the superpower of someone like me who gets to come in from the outside. I don't have the baggage. I don't have the, well, I don't know why we do it, but we've always done it, so I'm just going to go along with it. I'm willing to poke holes in that and ask sometimes impertinent questions. By the way, you can get that just by adding someone to your team. She'll see something you all missed. It's amazing. One of the most powerful things you can do is hire someone right out of school. They don't have any preconceived notions about how this is supposed to work. They literally see things we don't see anymore. My favorite example of that is some of you can't see the number here. Many of you can. Some of you, I'm sure, have some amount of color blindness because men. Sorry. So this is the nature of the beast. Do not be afraid to challenge the status quo. I know a lot of organizations, you introduce a new idea and people are just like, oh, nope. Hang on, why won't that work here? Now, by the way, this is on us as more experienced people. We need to encourage our junior developers. We need to give them the ability, the platform to ask these kinds of questions, to point these things out, because we don't see it. We're just used to it. This is why copy editors are amazing people, because they look at my writing and they're like, dude, you totally wrote this wrong. And I'm like, oh yeah, you're right, I can see that. The way that I make my writing not suck is by making the computer read it to me. Because my brain will move words around, because my brain knows what I was trying to say. The computer just reads what I wrote. And then I realize, oh, that sounds terrible. Let me try that again. My favorite personal example of this was years and years and years ago. One of my very first assignments out of school, I was given this task of going and capitalizing something on our billing stuff. And so super, super simple request. This was like junior dev, we're going to get you started on the code base, so go capitalize names on billing addresses or something like that. And so my tech lead basically told me exactly what to do, where to go in the code, and then now just go type. And so, her answer to me was, we have this function that does capitalization, so just use that. And I'm looking at this function, and it took like 17 arguments, and I couldn't figure out why. Because in my head, I'm thinking, shouldn't this just be like one argument? Here's the string. Give me back the capitalized string. I couldn't for the life of me see why this should take more than maybe two. And so I was really puzzled by this, and I could not get my head wrapped around what this home-rolled solution was trying to do. And so I took a step back and I thought, how long is this going to take me to figure out? How long before I get comfortable using this thing that some developer wrote some number of years ago? Probably hours. And so I thought, well, that doesn't seem right. This seems like the kind of thing the language should do for me. There must be a language feature that says like capitalize or make capital or uppercase or something, right? So I did a little poking around, and sure enough, there's a built-in function. Let's use that. So the following week, we're in our team meeting, going around the room, what are you working on? And so it got to my turn, and I talked about the little capitalization assignment, and my lead looked at me and said, oh, did you use so-and-so's function? I said, no. And there was like this record scratch moment. Every head in the room turned to me, and I'm kind of going, uh-oh, did I do something wrong? And so I explained what I did. And to be very clear, I was by far the least experienced developer in that room. I was a few months out of school. Everyone else had been doing this for at least a couple years. I was the only one in that room that knew the language had that feature. Now, I can't tell you when it was added. I don't know if it was added a few weeks before I started, a few years before I started, if it had been there for 15 years. I have no idea. These folks fell prey to, that's how we've always done it. Now, there's two lessons I take away from that. First and foremost, you should always embody the lazy developer ethos. If you think there should be an easier way, there probably is. You should find it. The other really important lesson for all of us is never, ever underestimate the value of a fresh set of eyes. It's incredibly powerful if someone comes in who's never seen your code, what they'll find. In my previous organization, we started doing these peer review architecture reviews. So for most of our tenure, what we'd do is inside our own line, we would review each other's architecture. But we eventually figured out, we need to do more cross-pollination. And so we started setting up these reviews with other architects from around the company. And it was a great way of sharing ideas, a great way of getting fresh perspectives, a great way of reaching across the proverbial aisle. And we inevitably spotted stuff that we wouldn't before because, well, we're used to just living in our own little insular worlds. And then you start talking to people that work on different parts of the company, different applications, you learn some stuff. Let's talk about solutioning, also known as the XY problem or the jump to conclusion mat. In our industry, we love to go straight to solution, typically before we even understand what the problem is. I think this might be one of the most important quotes that you can find in our space. This is Rich Hickey. Rich Hickey's got so many great quotes, but I love this one. Most of the big problems we have with software are problems of misconception. We do not have a good idea of what we're doing before we do it, and then we just go, 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 go. I mean, how many times have you been on a project where we don't have the requirements yet, but we have the development staff, so start building. And you're like, but what do you want me to build? I don't know, just build some stuff. So you realize we're going to throw most of that away. Oh, that's okay. I mean, it makes so little sense to me. Why would you start doing? You would never do that in the real world, would you? You would never hire a construction company and say, go build me a building. And they're like, great, where are the blueprints? They're like, we don't have them yet. But just start digging holes and stuff. Start pouring concrete. I mean, honestly, they'd probably do it. They're like, whatever, you're paying. But it's illogical. It's illogical. I am absolutely convinced problems of misconception are endemic in our industry. A friend of mine told me they were on a project where their product owner kept talking about client and customer. And the developers all assumed those were interchangeable terms. They were synonyms. They meant the same thing. And so they developed for the first few months assuming client and customer were the same concept. And then they were in a meeting with their product owner, and the product owner literally said, that'll work for a client, but not a customer. And everyone went, wait, what? And it turns out, while they are similar, they are distinct things with some nuance. Now, again, to reiterate what Rich was talking about, there is no amount of automated testing. There is no type system. There is no source code analyzer that can find problems of misconception. It is in our best interest to avoid the problem in the first place rather than having to work around it later. We have spent almost my entire software career shifting left. I was watching this news hit where this FBI agent was talking about how the FBI is always trying to solve problems left of boom. In other words, before the problem happens, before the proverbial or real bomb goes off, as opposed to what they often have to do, which is investigate after the fact. Right of boom. And I thought, that's funny. We call that shift left. We've been doing it again, my entire career. That's the goal, is to find these problems before they've even been entered into the system. We often will fixate on details that don't matter. We often will make assumptions. You know, you probably had someone say, hey, how do I get the last 3 characters of a file name? And of course, your first reaction might be, well, yeah, here's what you do. Here's how you parse that. And it's like, wait, hang on. Why do you need the last 3 characters of a file name? Well, because file extensions are always 3 characters. Well, except when they're not. Just like with NIH, it's in your best interest to ask why. Our job is to solve problems. You know, I mean, you think about what we do, we just tinker. We play with computers and tinker with stuff. When I think about what attributes make people good programmers, it's having that inner, I want to play with this problem. I'm going to keep banging on this until I solve it. There's nothing wrong with slowing down. We get in so much trouble when we try to go, 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 go. One of the phrases I utter to my son repeatedly is, take the time it takes so it takes less time. It is always in your best interest when you're packing for a trip. Do it earlier, because then you're less stressed. You know, so my travel backpack never gets unpacked. I have an entire separate set of charging cables and charging bricks and everything, and it always stays in my backpack because I never want to get in a trip and go, oh no. And I'm also very anal retentive about like double checking everything. You know, I put my bag in my car and I open it up. Yep, there's my laptop. Yep, there's my passport. And that works like 99% of the time. I'm sad to even say this, but earlier this year, I was traveling, and I get to the airport, and I go through security, and I use, in the US, we have a thing called Clear, which I can use for identifying myself at some airports. And so I didn't need to show any identification because my irises essentially are my ID in this system. And I get to the security, and I reach into my pocket, I take out my phone, and I'm like, wait, where's my wallet? I don't have my wallet. And I realized, oh, I bet my wallet's at home. And so I called my wife and I said, is there any chance my wallet's sitting there on the counter? And she said, yep. I said, okay. And I had this thought, can I make this entire trip work without having my wallet? Can I just buy everything on my phone? Probably not. So I said, is there any chance you can run my wallet down to me on your way? And she's like, sure, no problem. And luckily for me, I had enough time where that was workable. But I looked at my kid and I said, see, this is why I ask you to double check before you go, do you have everything you need? And earlier this fall, he had a soccer game, and we get this text message from him saying, could you please bring me my shin guards? I'm like, really? Did I not ask you to double check that you had your cleats and your shin guards and your socks? And it's good times. It's good times. Teenagers are a whole thing. As I said earlier, one of my wife's all-time favorite quotes is, stop solutioning me. Tell me what your requirements are. It is in our best interest to pause, take some time to reflect. Is there a simpler approach? Have I made this overly complicated? You also need to be very, very aware of yak shaving. We've all engaged in this. Well, let's see. In order to install this, I need to install this package manager. In order to install this package manager, I need to install a newer version of Python. In order to install a new version of Python, oh, geez, I need to recompile my operating system. Okay, all right. And the next thing you know, you're shaving a yak, you're covered with yak hair, and you're itchy, and you're like, I don't know what I'm doing here. Oh, that's right, I just wanted to install this package. I knew there was a reason. Be careful here, right? It happens all the time. We just keep going down this rabbit hole, and down this rabbit hole, and down this rabbit hole, and you're not sure what happened. So eventually, we just need to put the clippers down and ask ourselves, what were we trying to do here? So don't be afraid to break out of the loop. One of my favorite ways of doing this is to explain it to someone else. By the way, you can even just explain it to a rubber ducky. That works too. It doesn't even need to be a real animate thing. It's stunning how often that will unlock something in your brain, or you'll go, oh, wait a minute. This happened to me this spring, actually. I was working on some code, and it just wasn't working, and I was getting so frustrated, and I finally copied it and emailed to my buddy, and I'm like, Jonathan, what the heck is going on here? He said, Nate, let's hop on a Zoom call. We hopped on a Zoom call, and I started explaining it, and I immediately said, I got it. That needs to be not equals instead of equals. And of course, Jonathan hadn't done a thing. He hadn't said a word. He just smiled. So yes, rubber ducky. There's a good reason to have one of those on your desk. Explain the problem to a rubber ducky, and it will help you. Trust me on that one. Sometimes it's just distracting your brain. So have a piece of paper, do a little doodling, you know, maybe daydream, take a walk, stretch. One of my all-time favorite things, let's just go get a cup of coffee. I'm convinced a cup of coffee solves almost all our problems. Double check your assumptions. If you're still, you know, I don't know what's going on here, don't be afraid to take a nap. Sleep's pretty powerful, friends. We all should sleep more. I don't think there's anybody in this room that's like, oh, I get too much sleep. And this is where I start getting into R mode versus L mode, the way our brain works. And this is basically forest versus trees. So the R mode processing is that search and retrieve aspect of our brain. This is nonverbal, and unfortunately not something we can control. It just runs in the background with really unpredictable results. You'll be amazed how often the answer comes sometime later. If you've ever been watching a movie or a show and you're like, who is that? Where did I see that actor? And like 20 minutes later, you're like, oh, Val Kilmer. It's like, where'd that come from? The only way we can unleash the R mode is by distracting the L mode. All right, so we got to prime the pump. You got to think about the problem and then do something that distracts the L mode, like taking a shower or mowing the lawn or doing the dishes. And what that does is engages the L mode, and the R mode goes, oh, okay, finally, I get to control things for a bit here. That L mode is so loud. You start to think, like, what is the actual problem here? What is the use case? Is there a simpler way? I'm convinced we need to be ruthlessly pragmatic. It's incredibly dangerous in our industry to be dogmatic. I've seen this way too much in our space. A lot of dogmatism around programming languages, around solutions, around capitalization rules. Do not be formulaic. A friend of mine was consulting on this project, and the first thing he noticed was, oh my God, there aren't any tests. We should write some tests. And then because he's not a formulaic person, he took a step back and said, hang on a sec here. How long has everyone been here? And it turns out everybody had 10 or more years of experience on the code base. They knew the code base intimately. So he realized, wait a minute, that's actually not what we need to start with. So he adapted to what was in front of him and said, no, we'll come back to that one. All right, last thing I'm going to talk about very quickly is imposter syndrome. I'm amazed how many of my grad students suffer from this one. They're all full-time working adults. They're all doing well in industry. We all suffer from imposter syndrome, every single one of us. All right, this tweet made me laugh. I had such a bad day at work yesterday, I thought maybe I'm not cut out for this field. We've all had that experience. That's okay. I was on an expert panel once where we decided we'd all introduce ourselves and say that we write crappy code, except we used a stronger word. You've probably stared at some code and said, hey, what idiot wrote this? And then it gradually dawns on you that it was you. Like, oh, I'm the one who wrote this. That's okay. That's okay. We actually should be a little disappointed in stuff we wrote a while back. That tells me I've learned and I've grown. That's good. It's actually worse if we're not improving. So I love this one too. I just spent the last 2 hours debugging a component, and then I realized I was editing the wrong file. I swear this happens to me 2 or 3 times a month. I'm like, oh, God, I edited the wrong file again? By the way, you run into these individuals who think they know everything. They don't, and that's dangerous. We're getting very specialized. If you think about the term doctor 100 years ago, very broad term. Same person cut off a leg, pulled a tooth, gave you a shave. I guess we'd call them full-stack doctors. It's not the way it is today, right? Doctors now are incredibly specialized. There's orthopedic surgeons that just do one joint. Right? There are actually a specialization of being a general practitioner, which I think is hilarious. We're in the same world. Our software body of knowledge has exploded. You know, it wasn't that long ago that you'd say, well, if you're really serious about this, you'd build your own hardware. But you probably haven't built a computer recently. Well, not there's anything wrong with that. I mean, look at the cloud. Most of us are short-term leasing someone else's compute. You cannot possibly know it all. Heat, death of the universe will happen first. In fact, you're going to miss almost everything. Sorry. Kelsey's got so many great tweets, but I love this one. Focus means you won't get to surf every wave. He's absolutely right. There's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know. This is something we need to do for our junior developers. I'm not sure why this worked. I'm not sure what's happening here. That's important for us to be able to do. It's okay to admit you don't know something. It's not okay to shame someone else. Say, I'm surprised you didn't know that. Right? I'm actually kind of disappointed when people do that. It's just not, it's not cool. Not cool. Well, friends, I hope this was useful. I really do appreciate your time and attention here. The end of the day, folks, software projects are people projects. All right? They're full of personalities. They're full of emotions. They're full of opinions. There's more to patterns than just the software patterns. Consider these cognitive biases. Hopefully awareness will help you navigate that. I do appreciate your time and attention. I wish you luck. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. Cheers.